There were rumours, stories told under hushed voices, strange occurrences local people shared with each other in private. Something strange, something fearsome lurked in the darkness of the forest. These words rang in my head as I approached the cottage. In the sky above, storm clouds were gathering, and the light of the day was coming to an end. The cottage was a cosy-looking place, and a sight I was glad to see after my travels had made me weary. The reasons for me being here were not completely of my own. Indeed, after reading parts of a diary written by the grandfather of my friend James, I had become engaged in an intense discussion about ghosts with him, and that ghosts, from my point of view, were utter nonsense. It was, after all, the year 1846, and in this modern age such things of ghosts should be consigned to storybooks. James, being open-minded, assured me that there had been some strange occurrences, and his grandfather would not have made up what he wrote in his diary. So, with great intrigue, I told James I wished to visit the area his grandfather was living in at the time he wrote the diary, and perhaps stay a few nights. James's grandfather grew up and wrote the diary whilst living in Devon. In fact, one of the reasons he moved to London was because of the ghostly happenings. James knew of a cottage owned by a local farmer which was rarely used, so I was welcome to stay there. I gladly accepted the offer. James, however, informed me he would not be accompanying me, and even went so far as to warn me not to go alone. As I believed ghosts did not exist, I had no quarrel in visiting the place. My work in the past few months had been tiresome, so I was glad of the rest. Rest I did not get during the journey to the cottage, for the journey was terrible, and I feared my death would come from nothing so exotic as an ancient spectre, but from travelling muddy roads. With the key already picked up from the local farmer, William Jones, I unlocked the front door. It creaked as it opened, and I was greeted by the pleasant sight of a cosy interior. The hall had a wooden floor, and opposite the front entrance there was an old picture of a quaint country scene and some hooks for hanging clothing. I took off my shoes and my overcoat that I hung on one of the hooks. I walked into the living room. Again more pleasantries abounded. A log fireplace and a comfortable-looking armchair, a table, some ornaments, another chair, and a low chest of drawers, on which was a painting of an old man sitting at a fireplace, perhaps the grandfather of Jones the farmer. There was a door on the other side of the living room, which joined to a short corridor. I walked down it and found the bedroom. It was small, but comfortable, with a good-sized bed. I put my case to one side of the room and went to the kitchen. The farmer had kindly stocked up the kitchen with some supplies, and I had brought some of my own. There was an old stove where I lit the coal and boiled a kettle of water. I made myself a cup of tea and went back to the living room, where I sat down with the diary that James had kindly lent me. I had only had the time to read small sections until now, and was looking forward to reading it in its entirety. I started at the beginning, which was not intriguing, and consisted mainly of some potatoes going missing from the store, and the energies that were extended in looking for their whereabouts. I was glad, though, to see the strange occurrences that had brought me here soon started to appear in the words in front of me. Mrs. Jacob, married to a local farmer, had complained upon hearing the strangest noises at night-time. She reported hearing the shouting and screaming of people echoing across the fields. Her husband could not corroborate her story, for he was asleep when the voices could be heard, and when woken the voices had gone. There was a man called Tom Blake, who ran into the local pub one evening, claiming to have been walking through the forest and to have been accosted by the strangest of sounds, children and women crying, but he could not find their location. The crying grew so loud he ran in fear of his life. Alfred McCoy, an Irish carpenter who was not a year off 70, had started to act strangely, and had gone from being a friendly, jolly man to becoming a recluse. Finally, one day, having been seen by a local villager, McCoy walked in the direction of the forest and was never seen again. These stories were fascinating to read, although vague and of no real substance. In fact, it was dawning on me, this was not so much a diary as it was the hobby of a man who enjoyed writing down stories of the unexplained. Before leaving, I asked James if there was any reason that so many ghostly rumours had originated from this area. He believed there was a village in this region that had been ransacked by the Romans, or possibly a medieval town that a sheriff had ordered be burnt to the ground for rumours of witchcraft. Both, or either of these acts, ones of murder, leaving many lost souls. Of course, the region itself, not far from Stonehenge, was widely known for witchcraft and supernatural occurrences. I was told that in the diary there were some longer sections explaining what may be behind the mysterious happenings. I did not read any further into the diary that evening, and retired early to bed, for I was feeling exhausted from the long journey. That night, as I lay on the bed, I could hear the wind blowing outside, and the occasional patter of rain against the window. Not one to have ever been scared of the dark or of solitude, I was feeling decidedly uneasy. Perhaps being alone in the middle of the countryside was having a bigger effect on me than I imagined. This feeling, however, was unexpected, and I had travelled and stayed in lodgings alone before. I pushed my head back into the pillow and closed my eyes, my weariness coming to my aid, for I slowly drifted into sleep, the sounds of the wind and rain becoming distant. I dreamt of the forest which lay near the cottage. Alas, my mind went deeper into the woods. There was darkness. I could see no person or animal, but there was something menacing. Unease was about, and silence, absolute silence, a deathly silence. This place felt haunted by a presence I could not discern. In my dream, a sound broke in, a slight knocking from the window. Was it a dream or real? I stirred in my sleep. Where was I? I couldn't remember where I was. My heart leapt. I woke with a jolt. I was in the cottage. Of course, I was in the cottage. I laid my head back on the pillow, breathing a sigh of relief. The wind outside had picked up, and it howled as it blew by the cottage. Again, I heard the knocking at the window. My heart pounding, I slowly turned my head toward the noise. Occasional breaks in the clouds brought some illumination from the dim light of the moon to my view. There was what looked like a thin finger at the window pane. I froze. What could it be? The wind blew again, and a branch from a tree knocked against the glass. The finger, much to my relief, was a twig, an offshoot of the branch. However, I was unsettled, to say the least. The next morning, I woke to the gentle sound of raindrops against the window. The pleasant sight of morning lifted my spirits, for I had not slept well. It was my first night, so I was not overly concerned, and believed I would soon settle in. I washed, dressed, and made myself some fried eggs, tea, and cut some large slices of bread for breakfast. As I sat in the living room, opposite the fireplace, I looked across at the chest of drawers and at the picture of the old man. It was the strangest thing. I could have sworn the day before the painting showed the side of his face, but now he stared outwards, facing me full on. Could it be? Was this a figment of my imagination? I was tired yesterday, so I may have only glanced at the painting and not fully taken note of his position. The old man's eyes seemed to stare at me. I put down my breakfast, stood up and walked towards the painting. I picked it up and peered into his eyes. I was lost for a moment in fear. Could the painting have changed? No, I must not have remembered it correctly. I put the painting face down on the chest of drawers. I wished not to see it again. I finished my breakfast and decided to have a short walk. After leaving the cottage, I walked down the path a short distance and then turned off onto a smaller path that headed into the forest, leading me up an incline towards the top of a ridge. Strangely, the forest seemed familiar to me, as though I'd been there before. But that could not be, for I'd never visited this place in my life. When I got to the top of the ridge, I looked down a path that led deep into the forest, and in the distance I could see a figure, some way off, so I could not make out his or her features. "Good morning," I called, but I got no response. The figure stood motionless. If I was not mistaken, it was that of an old man with a beard. I called again. "Good morning, sir." Still, I got no response. I walked towards the figure. As I did so, he or she turned and walked into the forest and out of sight. Strange, I thought to myself. Who could it be? And why did they not call back? I was left feeling uneasy. I decided not to walk towards where I saw the figure, for I was, I confess, a little scared. I turned and headed back to the cottage. I was relieved to return. I hung up my jacket, took off my walking boots, and went into the living room. And lo and behold, the painting! It was on the floor. James, or perhaps his friend, the farmer, was playing a cruel joke. "Do you hear me?" I said. "I know you're around here somewhere." I quickly ran around the cottage, checking all the doors. "Are you here?" I shouted again. "I am not amused." I went back to the living room and sat down. Could it have been possible? Could I have left it in such a way that it fell off the chest? Yes, I've been tired, and this place has unsettled me. Perhaps it could have fallen off the chest by itself. I sighed with relief and sat back. A sharp breath of air braced my neck. I jumped with a jolt and span round. What in God's name? But no one was there. It must have come from outside. Or perhaps it was my mind playing tricks on me. Tricks or no tricks, I was thinking about leaving. This place was having an impression on me, and I was starting to view the world akin to how James saw it. I grabbed the diary from the shelf and began to read. Further stories of unexplainable voices, knocks, another disappearance, until finally I got to a section of possible explanation. There were stories that long ago the Romans had pillaged this place and killed the villagers. Although there's no clear evidence of this, and the Romans were unlikely to carry out such slaughter unless they were severely provoked. No, I do not believe this is the case. There were, however, accounts of witchcraft in this area, and by order of the local sheriff, possibly even following instructions from King Richard I, the village was burnt down. There are rumours that a local witch had grown so strong in the dark arts that she was taking over a whole village. This could not be tolerated, and the local area was searched and ransacked. The women and even children were rounded up and slaughtered. Few people from the village were able to escape. Many were hunted down as they fled through the fields. The witch was found and killed. Perhaps as she died, she put a curse on this place, and now the lost souls wander this area, never able to reach the next world. But this, of course, is all conjecture, and I doubt I will ever know the full truth. Strange, I thought to myself. If what I've been experiencing is some sort of haunting, then why is it not better known of in this area? When I travelled here, chatting to those in the train carriage and then the horse carriage, everyone knew of this area, but stories of ghosts were no more than local myth or piffle. Suddenly, from outside, I heard the groan of a man. I stood bolt upright, turned to look out the window, but could see nothing. I rushed over to the door and ran outside. "Hello? Who's there? Are you hurt?" Nothing. I looked in all directions, but no one or no animal was in sight. I listened, but there was silence. A slight gust of wind rustled the leaves, and again, silence. My heart pounding, I raced back inside and locked the door behind me. I rushed into the kitchen and seized a carving knife from a drawer and proceeded to search the small cottage, every cupboard, door and room. I found no sign or sight of anyone. Was I being haunted? Or was my mind running amok with me? Either way, I resolved to go and find the farmer and ask him if he had heard anything strange of late. I could not be the only one cursed with these mysterious incidents, unless, of course, it was just my mind. I left the cottage in a rush and headed for the farmer's house. It was not nearby, and even at my swift pace, it took half an hour to reach his lodgings. Part of the journey took me through the edge of the forest, which only forced my panic to grow. The farmer and his family lived in a new Victorian farmhouse with large living quarters, an outhouse and some stables next to it. Arriving at the front door, I expected to hear dogs barking, but I heard nothing. I banged on the door and no one answered. I banged again, louder, still no answer. I went to the outhouse and knocked on the entrance door, but nothing. I remembered the farmer saying to me he may leave for a few days to travel to a nearby market. This was not a short distance, and with the bad weather, those few days may be even longer. I had feared he and his family may not be here, but I had cast that fear aside, wishing not to confront it. The stables were empty and the cart had gone. It appeared I was alone. The nearest village was Tiverton, and from here and by foot it would take me at least a day to walk. Now it was gone afternoon, and I would certainly not want to travel at this time, as night would soon draw in. Alas, I feared the hour was too late, and I did not fancy sleeping in the stables or in the courtyard. I would go back to the cottage and leave the very next morning. There was no shame in admitting I'd left the cottage early, for I feared for my life. With a heavy heart, I began my journey back to the cottage. I walked into the forest and took the same route as I had before. As before, no one was in sight. I stopped for a moment, for I thought I heard the sound of a voice in the distance. I started walking, and I could hear the very faint sound of a young child crying. The crying was a long way off. I walked further to where I believed the sound was coming from. The crying grew louder. "Hello!" I shouted. "Who's there?" I got no reply. The crying got louder, but I could see no one. I walked closer to where the sound was coming from. Suddenly, another child's cry came in earshot, and another, and another. "Are you hurt?" Nothing. I got no reply. And there! Another voice. This time the cries of a young woman. "Please, I cannot help if you do not respond." But no sight could I make of them. Were they hidden, concealed by the overgrown trees and bushes? Was I in danger? I decided not to say another word. Without warning, a new sound joined the chorus of crying, the pounding of horses' hooves, far off, but coming close. I desperately looked around, but could see nothing. My mind cried out to flee, but my feet were rooted by fear to the spot. "Don't be so stupid," I pleaded to myself. "This will not help." I regained control of myself and took my first steps towards the trees. The sound of hooves was getting louder, and what sounded like a group of horses were bearing down on me. I turned and looked behind me, and all of a sudden I could have sworn I saw the faintest outlines of a rider on a horse. And then an incredible gust of wind, so strong it knocked me off my feet. I flew to the ground and rolled over several times. I came to a halt, and I heard voices echoing in the trees, cries and shouts. My heart pounding and my skin sweating, I lay on the ground. The crying and the hooves had gone, and I was alone again. I believed, being out here alone, I was easy prey for lost spirits. When I got to the cottage, I was emotionally exhausted. The night was coming, and I was scared. I rushed around the cottage, checking it from top to bottom as before. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I then packed, ready to leave first thing in the morning. The night was setting in, and I was scared. I had a sip of port from a bottle I brought with me, but did not drink more, for I did not wish to be drunk in such circumstances. As I lay in bed that night, I started to think what was happening to me was amazing. I'd never believed in ghosts, and now I had experiences that seemed indisputable. I should be excited, even hoping for the sighting of a ghost this evening, but no, the uncertainty was only creating fear. I hoped this evening I would be left in peace. One more night, and then I could go. Outside, it had started to rain, and the gentle sound of drops against the window soothed my racing mind, and I started to drift to sleep. But then, breathing. Could I hear breathing? I opened my eyes, and no one was in the room. I closed them again, and a few moments later the breathing returned. My heart began to beat faster. I opened my eyes, and the breathing stopped. Suddenly, under the floorboards, I heard what sounded like someone being dragged along the ground. Then, nothing. I listened, not knowing what to think. There was silence. Then the sound of a thud from under the floor. I lurched back in the bed. Fear pulsed in my veins. My heart pounded. Again, I heard the sound of thudding, like someone banging their fist into the ground. Then silence, and after a moment, the worst of all, a faint moan. At first it was very quiet, then louder and louder until I could clearly hear the moan of a man coming from under the floorboards. I covered my ears. I could not bear to hear. Was I to die? The moaning stopped, and outside in the living room a door slammed. I lurched back in bed, my heart beating so fast it felt as though it were to burst from my chest. The floorboards creaked, and I could hear footsteps coming towards the bedroom door. The sound was faint, and at times all I could hear was the creaking of a floorboard as something got closer to the bedroom. There was a long silence. And then the door handle turned, and the door creaked open. I screamed at the top of my lungs, jumped out of the bed and ran over to the door. I couldn't stand the tension for a moment longer. I pulled open the door and nothing. I rushed into the main room, but no one was there. My imagination again? I believed not. I walked back to the bedroom, a wreck of nerves. I closed the door and returned to bed. Sitting on the edge of the bed, tears formed in my eyes. I lay back, not sure if I could take much more. A dark figure stood at the end of the room. The figure did not move, as I did not move, frozen in fear. I could not make out any features. It may have been wearing a cloak. Then a moan, and I shuddered as though death was upon me. The figure started to float towards me, and I laid there, paralysed by fear. The room chilled as though it were winter, and a breath of cold, frosty air flowed from my mouth. The figure leaned in close to me, and from what I assumed was the hood of a cloak, through a gap in the material, the very slight appearance of a wrinkled face could be seen. The face moved from side to side as though swaying in the wind. The skin was grey, as though it were stone. Tears rolled down my cheeks, not from crying, but fear. The moaning I heard before came from outside, the moaning of a man. What was going on? The figure turned its head, and then a voice came from outside. "Run! Pray thee, run!" The figure lurched towards the window, then it rose higher and screamed. That was more than I could stand. I darted past the figure into the hall. I didn't stop to unlock the door. I slid the bolt and kicked it open. The lock broken, I rushed out of the cottage and up the path. It may have been spiritual awareness, or possibly blind thought, but I felt a calling towards the forest. The very place I should be running away from, I ran into. I ran through the darkness and the rain, through the forest, towards the place where I had seen the old man. I ran down the path where I hadn't dared tread before. I slowed my pace. This was the place from my dream. I felt a great sense of unease, a sense of evil. I should not have come here. From the darkness of the forest appeared the outline of an old, withered man. Fear gripped me. This was a trap. I took a few steps back. The old man was but a skeleton, with a thin cover of grey skin. For all my fear, I felt enticed to walk towards him, as though he was pulling my soul. Like McCoy, the Irish carpenter I'd read about in the diary, was I too to vanish into the forest, never to be seen again? Each step I took towards the deathly old body, the more I felt as though in a dream. Memories of when I was a child flashed before me, and when I was older, happy times and some sad. Perhaps my mind was trying to find a way out. There was a strange tugging in my mind, like I'd forgotten something and was trying to remember. This was strange, the memory of being in a stone fort. I didn't grow up in a stone fort. And then a rush of realization, a thunderbolt of knowledge pouring back into my head. I was here in the past. I was here at the beginning. The witch who had brought death upon the people of the village, it was she who wanted them to die and tricked us into killing them, so she could harvest their souls. All she had to do was create suspicion that the villagers were under her influence. She knew the sheriff had a stone heart, and with emotions stirred, he did what she wanted. There was never any excuse for killing them, though, but we did it for no better reason than suspicion. I rode with the sheriff's men. Our orders were that a tiny village was guilty of following a witch. I was one of those that killed the villagers. When we found the witch, it was I who struck her down, but the witch put a curse upon me, using my own sins against me to feel the guilt for all those that had died, dooming me never to pass on to the afterlife, to be reborn again and again, to experience the crimes I had committed. But I was to make amends for my sins. None of the villagers needed to die, and yet we killed them. And since that time I have passed from one life to the next, slowly regaining the memories of who I was in each new life, gaining knowledge, gaining awareness, putting my next incarnation to the place I needed it to be, closing my memories off even to myself so she would not be aware of whom I was. All my planning came down to this moment. The old man's body was falling apart, and she needed a new one. This is why I could hear and sense the ghosts. This is why I, above all else, was being haunted. The reason the apparition screamed was because it needed me to run into the forest so she could possess my soul. The man I saw was a dead body, his soul long departed, his body possessed by the witch. He, though not the first, there being many before him, these captive bodies, the link for the witch from the underworld to this world. As the possessed body of the old man approached me, I readied myself for what was to come. I was uncertain of what to do, but instinct told me to stay. The old body was close to collapse, and mine would make a timely replacement. I stepped forward and grabbed its neck. Its eyes lit up red, and white vapour began to pour from its body. I could feel energy pulsing inside of me. I had the strength to finish this. I'm not sure how, but finally finding her link to the world of the living after so many years and so many deaths, she would not take another. The remains of the man began to wail, the head thrown back in rage. It did not understand what was happening. It could not take a life that shouldn't be there. And then, in its face, out of white smoke and vapour, the outline of the witch could be seen. An old hag with anger and evil seething from its being. She screamed, and the forest echoed with her shock. I held on tightly to its neck. I knew I could not let go. It tried to pull back from me, striking my sides with its bone hands, to no avail. If I was to die here tonight, she would be coming with me. Finally, after an almighty scream, the remains turned to ashes in my hands. I dropped to my knees. From the ground around me, apparitions, glowing white figures of men, women and children, floated up from the ground. In the distance and nearby, more and more floated from the ground, lighting the forest in a marvellous display. Released, finally released. I collapsed. As the morning light hit my eyes, I regained consciousness. The forest was calm, and all was peaceful. There was no sign of what had occurred last night. A strange feeling overcame me at that point. My whole purpose in life had been fulfilled, but I was still here, with much of my earthly life to live. What was I to do with the rest of my time? I would savour every waking moment. I would forever be happy in the knowledge that this chapter of evil had come to an end. I also now had direct knowledge of workings of the past, so I suppose I could be a great historian. I knew I would not be able to tell anyone of my past life, unless I wanted to be certified for the mental hospice. Then again, maybe my purpose had not been completely fulfilled. There was still much good I could do in my life. The people that died in part by my hand would not be forgotten. As I walked back to the cottage, I wondered what stories of ghosts I would tell to James. Now that I was a believer, and to all intents and purposes, I was a ghost myself.